Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. The King James Version says it this way: till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled. The NIV uses the definition of a jot. It's the smallest letter in the Hebrew language, the letter yod, which looks like an apostrophe. What's a tittle? It's actually only a part of a letter, like one of the four little extensions at the top and bottom of a capital I, those little bitty extensions. Well, Jesus continues, therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. How do we understand this when we know that the Apostle Paul later said this? No one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of our sin. For that matter, what about the things that Jesus did that led to accusations that he violated the law himself? He never apologized for anything, including healing people on the Sabbath, and he defended his followers when they were criticized for picking grains to eat on the Sabbath and not washing their hands before they ate. Weren't those violations, some of them at least, bigger than jots and tittles? Well, the Jews used the expression the law in four different ways. First of all, they used it to mean the Ten Commandments. And then they used it to mean the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, also called the Pentateuch. Penta means 5, or 5 scrolls. These were the most important parts of the scriptures to the Jews. And then the law and the prophets was the third way. It referred to all of the scripture that they believed to be what we call inspired. Fourthly, they used it to mean the oral or the scribal law. In the time of Jesus, it was the last meaning that was most common. This scribal law was the one that was the problem. Here's what they would do. The fourth of the 10 commandments, the law, is remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Moses expands on it more than once in those first 5 books in the Pentateuch. He said, the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. Now, in one case, he points out that God created the earth in 6 days and rested on the 7th. That was one reason for the Sabbath. In another place, he reminds them that they were slaves in Egypt and were worked too hard. And so that was a great reason for the Sabbath, at least the benefits of the Sabbath day of rest. Well, here's what the oral and scribal law did with that. They asked, what is work? Now, this is all from the scholar William Barclay. Listen to this. All kinds of things were classified as work. For instance, to carry a burden on the Sabbath day is to work. But next, a burden has to be defined. So the scribal law lays it down that a burden is food equal in weight to a dried fig, enough wine for mixing in a goblet, milk enough for 1 swallow, honey enough to put upon a wound, oil enough to anoint a small member, water enough to moisten an eye salve, paper enough to write a customs house notice upon, ink enough to write 2 letters of the alphabet, read enough to make a pen, and so on, endlessly. So they spent endless hours arguing whether a man could or could not lift a lamp from one place to another on the Sabbath, whether a tailor committed a sin if he went out with a needle in his robe, whether a woman might wear a brooch or false hair, even if a man might go out on the Sabbath with artificial teeth or an artificial limb. They're carrying those things, you see. If a man might lift his child on the Sabbath day was another question. To write was to work on the Sabbath, but writing has to be defined. So the definition runs, he who writes 2 letters of the alphabet with his right or with his left hand, whether of one kind or of 2 kinds, if they are written with different inks or in different languages, is guilty. Even if he should write 2 letters from forgetfulness, he is guilty, whether he has written them with ink or with paint, red chalk, vitriol, or anything which makes a permanent mark. Also, he that writes on 2 walls that form an angle, or on 2 tablets of his account book, so that they can be read together, is guilty. But if anyone writes with dark fluid, with fruit juice, or in the dust of the road, or in sand, or in anything which does not make a permanent mark, he is not guilty. If he writes 1 letter on the ground and 1 on the wall of the house, or on 2 pages of a book, so that they cannot be read together, he is not guilty. That is a typical passage from the scribal law, and that is what the Orthodox Jew regarded as true religion and the true service of God. To heal was to work on the Sabbath. Now, obviously, this has to be defined. Healing was allowed when there was danger to life, and especially in troubles of the ear, nose, and throat. But even then, steps should be taken only to keep the patient from becoming worse. No steps might be taken to make them get any better. So a plain bandage might be put on a wound, but no ointment. Plain wadding might be put into a sore ear, but no medicated wadding. The scribes were the men who worked out these rules and regulations. The Pharisees, whose name means the separated ones, were the men who had separated themselves from all the ordinary activities of life to keep all these rules and regulations. It took that kind of separation in order to do that. To the strict Orthodox Jew in the time of Jesus, religion, serving God, was a matter of keeping thousands of legalistic rules and regulations. They regarded these petty rules and regulations as literally matters of life and death and eternal destiny. Clearly, Jesus did not mean that one of these rules and regulations was not to pass away. Repeatedly, he broke them himself, and repeatedly he condemned them. That is certainly not what Jesus meant by the law. For that is the kind of law that both Jesus and Paul condemned. So, what is the law that Jesus is saying must be fulfilled? Well, he answers this many times in more ways than one, but the one in chapter 19 helps give the whole picture in the context of the law Jesus is talking about that will not pass until it is fulfilled. So look over at Matthew 19. A man came up to Jesus and asked, "Teacher, what good thing must I do to get eternal life?" Why do you ask me about what is good? Jesus replied. There's only one who is good. If you want to enter life, keep the commandments. Which ones? He inquired. Jesus replied, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not give false testimony, honor your father and mother, and love your neighbor as yourself. All these I have kept, the young man said. What do I still lack? Jesus answered, if you want to be perfect, go sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me. Now, that last one is not actually one of the 10 Commandments, but it helps us understand the nature of what law Jesus is talking about. The Ten Commandments are all laws about honoring and respecting God and honoring and respecting others. In other words, love. Now, this may be a surprising reality, but the reason the scribes got into such detail about the definitions of work and other aspects of the law was because they wanted to actually fulfill the law. If they could define the laws precisely enough, they could theoretically at least do those things and their responsibility would be complete. God could not deny their place in the kingdom. They would deserve it. That was theoretically achievable. If you did everything perfectly, you could at that point say that you were finished. You had fulfilled the law. Well, keeping the law of love, on the other hand, would never be finished. Paul said it this way, "Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law." So, when we paid off one of our cars in person one time at the credit union, I was a little taken aback when the teller said, "Congratulations." I'd never made the final payment in person before, so I never thought of it as an event. But that was actually a debt that was paid, and they could no longer demand any payments at all. It was done. Well, that's not how it is with loving one another. We can't pay it off and say, "I'm done. I loved you. Don't expect anything more from me." We may show more love to someone than they show to us, but that doesn't ever mean that we can stop loving them until they catch up. The fact is that one person in every relationship does more than the other person, whether it's someone on the street that you can give to who can't give back at all, or it's your husband or wife who might give as much or more back to you. Equality isn't even the goal. When I do premarital counseling, I always tell them that the idea of a 50-50 relationship is a really bad idea. We sometimes call that transactional. In other words, it's a deal that we make with each other. As long as you do this much, I will do that much. The problem is, even if we're both trying to keep our side of the bargain, we tend to think that we've reached 50% before the other person thinks that we have. And they tend to think that they've reached the 50% before we think that they have. So about the time I get to 30%, I may think that I'm at 60%. And by the time she gets to about 45%, she thinks she's at 55%. So there's always this gap of 25% or so that neither of us thinks that we should be filling. I think I've referred to Paul Faulkner's title of a session in the Marriage Enrichment Seminar that he and Carl Rakeen did. They were both teachers at Abilene Christian University. But the title of the lesson on this issue was, "The problem with us is me." Well, that may or may not be true factually, but unless both people in any relationship try to have that attitude, the relationship will have some major problems. But the good news is that even if one person in the relationship has that attitude, the relationship can survive if the other person will accept the sacrifices of the greater giver. Now, survival is not the goal. The goal in a good relationship is always a competition to outgive the other person. Now, how is that fair? Or how is it even right? Well, it's because our debt is not to any other person in our lives except Jesus himself. The law of love is fulfilled by Jesus' loving sacrifice. That's what Jesus was saying when he said he came to fulfill the law. Through that sacrifice, every jot and tittle of the law has been fulfilled. And now we are the hands and feet of Jesus as we sacrifice our lives for others who are as undeserving as we are. Paul finishes that reminder in Romans 13. Look at this. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. So don't try to do the scribal thing and ask, who is my neighbor? You remember that question coming from a man who wanted to justify himself? He had just asked Jesus what to do to inherit eternal life, just like the man in Matthew 19. But this time, Jesus turned the question on him, and the man actually gave the same answer that Jesus had given to the man in Matthew 19. And it was a good answer, but then he wanted a definition of neighbor. He was thinking like those who tried to practice scribal law. So when Jesus answered by telling him the story that we call the Good Samaritan, Jesus revealed that this man had asked the wrong follow-up question. If he had understood that he was subject to the law of love, he would have understood that the real question is not who is my neighbor, but who am I? The question Jesus finished with was, who was a neighbor to the man in distress? So the man gave the right answer, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus said simply, go and do likewise. If you don't remember the details of that story, your homework is to reread Luke 10, verses 25 through 27. So go home and do that. But when we stop having active mercy for someone, we have stopped loving them. Active mercy. That's how our righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees. They look for boundaries. We live without boundaries when it comes to mercy and love. The next things Jesus says are applications of the law of love. He starts with the most extreme example. You've heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder. And anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Now, the theme of the Pepperdine Bible lectures this year was the most excellent way, and the main speakers examined 1 Corinthians 13. And of course, one of the characteristics of love is that it is not easily angered. Jesus is not talking about momentary emotional flashes when he says anyone who is angry with a brother or sister. He's talking about a state of anger and resentment that holds a grudge and does not show mercy. I don't believe that Jesus is saying that anytime we feel angry, we are subject to judgment, but anytime we act in anger, we are putting ourselves in danger of judgment. Anytime we can no longer show mercy to someone or do the best thing for them, then that is when we are being angry in that sense. And so this sometimes does require tough love, actually, when we have to not do something they might want us to do, or when we might need to tell them the truth about the dangers of what they are doing, or we might need to say no to what they want us to do. That can actually be a deeper love. But let's never use tough love as an excuse to avoid doing what we just don't want to do when someone has pushed us to what we might say is our limit. The question is, did Jesus reach his limit with me? Imagine being called by God to marry someone who will break your heart. That's exactly what happened to the prophet Hosea. God told him to marry a promiscuous woman. And apparently this young woman named Gomer had that reputation, and so he married her. It was God's plan to use Hosea and his family in the most extreme way I can imagine to address the extremely evil way that the people of his time were living. Now, God did not make Gomer unfaithful to Hosea. She was someone who had obviously been making those kinds of choices in her life. And God used her, and he used Hosea's love life and family life to teach Israel about God's love. Gomer was unfaithful, and that was the plan. She would leave Hosea, betray him, even sell herself to others. And yet, when God told Hosea to take her back, he obeyed. She had actually sold herself, probably into sexual slavery. But Hosea bought her out of slavery and brought her home and loved her. Now, all of this was a picture of God's relationship with us. In Hosea 3, verse 1, the Lord tells Hosea, "Go show your love to your wife again, though she is loved by another. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods." That's not cheap love. That's costly, painful, undeserved love. It's the kind of love that says, even when you run, I'll come after you. Even when you break my heart, I won't give up on you. That's what God did for Israel. And that's what he's done for us in Christ. That is just so extreme. So again, if you want more homework, you can go read Hosea chapters 1 through 4. But are Jesus' words less extreme than Hosea's assignment? Think about that. Was Jesus' assignment less extreme than Hosea's assignment? Now, the next lines are difficult for us because we don't understand the language and we don't understand the verbal structure that Jesus is employing. He says, again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, "Raka," is answerable to the court, and anyone who says, "You fool," will be in danger of hell. The word "raka" is not translated because it is not really translatable. As I understand it, it was more the way it was said, more of a sound of disgust than something that can be defined. Maybe a little like the opposite of the Marines' "boorah." It doesn't have a definition, but they know that that expresses camaraderie when they say it or that when they hear it said, and so they feel good whenever they hear that sound. Well, if "raka" was directed at you, it was the same kind of expression that didn't have a clear definition, but you knew that it was directed at you and this was not coming from a good place. So it's a misunderstanding to see the three terms, subject to judgment, answerable to the court, and in danger of the fire of hell, as three distinct things or three levels of danger or punishment. In fact, I don't want to go into the weeds too deeply, but this is a communication technique like a figure of speech that was commonly used by the Hebrews. It is called Henriatus. I'm far from an expert on the topic, but I actually thought I saw it in this before I knew what it was. I kind of had to look it up and define it. But after Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder,' and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment," he uses three ways of saying actually the same thing. So listen to the way I read it as one sentence. "But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Anyone who says to a brother or sister, 'Raka,' is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of the fire of hell." He's saying the same thing in three different ways for emphasis. It's like saying, "I hate broccoli. It's gross. It's awful. It's disgusting." See, those are not three different punishments for three different sins. Those are three ways of emphasizing the seriousness of the same sin. Saying "Raka" and "You fool" were just expressions of anger. Acting and speaking in anger is the sin that can lead us to making the lives of others a living hell. And when we act on that kind of anger, we may find ourselves, Jesus is saying, in danger of eternal hell. And when it comes to the word "therefore," we have to look for a connection with Jesus' point. He says, "This is true, therefore this is the kind of thing you should do when you've been in conflict with someone." So here it is. Therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar, let me find it, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. So, In this case, you're at least supposed to be the problem, right? Your brother or sister has something against you. Maybe they're right. You probably don't think so. But the facts aren't as important as your brother or sister. Even your acts of worship are not as important as your relationship with your brother or sister. Love is the highest law. And the same goes when you're in a legal dispute where you think that you're in the right, but someone else thinks that you're in the wrong. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way. Or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. So Jesus is saying that your money, your pride, justice, nothing is as important as your love for each other. So deal with it. As Paul says to the Corinthian brothers and sisters, the very fact that you have lawsuits among you means you have been completely defeated already. Why not rather be wrong? Why not rather be cheated? Okay, so let's make sure we go home with some things to apply in our relationships. Love cannot be applied apart from relationships with people. We can't say we have a great relationship with God, but we have kind of lousy relationships with people. You remember John's explicit statement of this reality. Whoever claims to love God and yet hates a brother is a liar. So we each need to think of the person or persons that we need to be reconciled with. Jesus makes it clear that it doesn't really matter whether you're the offender or you're the offended one. You need to have a loving relationship if you possibly can. Who do I need to love more deeply? That is a question to take home. The question is not, whose fault is it that things are so bad? Unless it's your fault and you know it. But if it's their fault, or if it's too complicated to figure out what went wrong, God can change your heart and help you love them without some kind of enforcement. In other words, it doesn't have to be a court case. The simple question is, what can I do to make that relationship better? Now, before you reach out to them, start by praying for patience and strength. Sometimes we worry about not being able to remember things like we used to. Well, maybe if we know or we believe that the other person caused the problem, we believe that the problem is with us is not me, but you. Maybe in that case, we need to be more forgetful. As usual, Jesus is our best example. At the end of John's Gospel, after Peter had broken his relationship with Jesus by denying that he even had a relationship with Jesus, Jesus was the one who went to Peter and asked him, Peter, do you love me? Well, Peter said he did love him, but Jesus knew that Peter felt that he was not worthy to be the leader that Jesus had chosen him to be, so he didn't plan to continue to be a leader. Well, Jesus had chosen Peter to love and care for his followers, his sheep. Peter was claiming to love Jesus, but he was not planning to love his sheep, at least not enough to serve them in the way Jesus had prepared him and equipped him to serve. That's why Jesus said, feed my sheep. Jesus didn't just say, well, you had your chance, Peter. Get on out of here. You don't deserve to claim to be my friend. You're dead to me. The point is, Jesus took the initiative even though he was the one who was wrong. Then when Peter resisted that, Jesus didn't just give up. It took 3 repeat efforts to restore the relationship to what it was designed to be. It will often take more than 1 or 2 or even 3 efforts to restore your broken relationships. In some cases, it may never happen. So try to be the one who will do whatever it takes. When you've prayerfully, though, done everything you can think of to do, but there is little or no improvement, you don't give up, but there's a time that you put it in God's hands and just continue to pray for them and do anything for them that you can as long as it is good for them. If it works, give God the glory. Don't take it upon yourself. Saving a relationship can require superhuman strength. That does not come from us. It comes through the Spirit of Christ. It takes a lot of humility to even keep trying in many cases. Don't make the mistake of letting pride take over when you've done a good thing. But what if you do everything you can think of to do, but nothing seems to work? Maybe it even opens wounds and it hurts more. Well, if you suffer even more because you're trying to love that person again, thank God for the privilege of suffering in His name. We don't love people for our own glory. We love people for His glory. So when we suffer because they refuse our love, we are suffering for His name. Listen to Paul's words in Romans 8. Now, if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in His sufferings, in order that we may also share in His glory. We usually think of the cross when we hear the term Christ's sufferings, right? But His greatest sufferings were actually the loss of people that He loved. All His apostles deserted Him. That hurt. Peter hurt Him even more when he denied knowing Him. But Judas hurt Him even more. I have no doubt that Jesus would have done the same thing for Judas that He did for Peter if only he had let Jesus love him in that way. Now, I believe that Jesus' greatest suffering was that act that Judas took of taking his own life and denying Jesus the chance to love Him again. But I also believe He suffers that for every lost person and every broken relationship. Paul also said in Romans 12:18, remember, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. We can do a lot if we make an effort to be peacemakers, not just peace lovers. But not everyone will accept our love. Some just won't. Let's just not use as far as it depends on you to mean only if it's your fault, only if it's my fault. Jesus didn't die for us because He was the one in the wrong. We don't give our lives to others and for others only when we are in the wrong. But when people will not allow us to reconcile with them and refuse our love, we share in His sufferings in order that we may share in His glory. That is an honor.